Welcome back to Nights with Chris Boyle. Joining us now is author and photographer Chris Epting. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the program.
My pleasure, Chris. How are you?
Doing great. So I don't know if you remember this, but you and I met probably like 6, 7, 8 years back when I was working in Orange County. I was at an event where someone was running from one end of the country to the other. He landed in Huntington Beach on the pier. You were there taking photos. I was there representing Michelle Steele's office at the OC Board of Supervisors. And I met, and you were this incredibly passionate guy. You knew all these amazing things about Huntington Beach, about the surrounding area. I had no idea then what a prolific author you are, but not only are you someone who loves Huntington Beach, a city that's close to my heart, you're someone who's written a lot, and you're someone who has developed a series of amazing relationships throughout your life that's led you to write these really spectacular and insightful memoirs. Talk to us a little bit. You've actually written a book describing how that writing process goes and giving advice to other writers who are seeking to travel down that career path. Talk to us a little bit about how you started traveling down this really interesting road.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's good to see you. I do remember that. I think it's longer than 6 years ago, and it was a war vet who had gone cross country. A really amazing guy walking across the country. And in fact, he and I talked about writing a book about it, but never got to it. But yeah, thank you for bringing that memory back. Like you say, I live in kind of two different writing worlds. I write about history and travel. I've done a lot of those books. But in the last 10 years or so, I've begun co-writing memoirs with people. And I mean, I've been really fortunate to find a diverse number of people that want to tell their story and have allowed me to help them tell it, from Phil Collin, the lead guitar player from Def Leppard, to John Oates, to the Doobie Brothers, to a guy named Tyrus, former pro wrestler, now on the Gutfeld show. So a real gamut of people. Shirley Babashoff, the great Olympian. There's Tyrus. And so to your point, I just released a book recently called Where One Hears the Rain, which is the subtitle, Finding Your Voice and Crafting Your Story from Inspiration to Publication. I've taught memoir writing now for almost 10 years, and so I wanted to begin sharing things that I've learned from working with other people.
So when I was a kid, my mom is actually the person who got me into reading memoirs because she went through a kick. My mom goes through kicks. I don't know if she's going to end up watching this episode, but she goes through kicks where she'll get like really, really into something and then like a year or two later just like abandon it altogether. And she went through this kick where she was reading memoirs all the time. I think it was Angela's Ashes. I think Angela's Ashes is the one that kicked it off. Yeah. And then she started reading all these different memoirs. And I read a few of them. And I mean, it's a really amazing method of writing. It's a really amazing medium because it allows you to, I don't know, in the same way that books are different than movies, they allow you to get into a person's head. Memoirs really do that on this deep level about people that you feel like you've had a relationship at a distance with, but then you're able to kind of close that gap.
Very well put. And Angela's Ashes is often held up as sort of the gold standard, which I think it is, of memoir. Frank McCourt's wonderful book, which he wrote, I think he was in his early 60s when he wrote that. So you don't have to start early. And in fact, I think a lot of times people I teach are in later years and they're really beginning to reflect on their lives. And to your point, memoir isn't a biography or autobiography. It's not your whole life. Memoir is really finding little moments in your life to unpack that sort of represent a larger truth. I get to that a lot in the new book and in classes as well, is helping people really find those 5 or 10 defining moments. And then from there, beginning to decide what will really make a good story or collection of stories.
Well, what's interesting, too, is when you talk about memoirs, it's something that a lot of people have the ability to write. Like when we think about a memoir, we think about, you know, like a very, very famous figure, right? You're talking about, you know, the guitar player for Def Leppard, or, you know, a Fox News guy, or, you know, these very, like, Hall & Oates, right? Like, those are very, very well-known people, but the reality is that when you look through history, a lot of our knowledge of history, quite frankly, is based off of the writings, the journalings, the memoirs of regular people who gave us tremendous and extremely important insights into the world around them at a certain period of time.
That's a great point, and I stress that a lot with people, that you know, we've all got experiences that other people can learn from. You don't have to be a household name or even well-known on any level. We also live in kind of a nice time today where there are plenty of small to mid-sized publishers looking for new voices, people that can come out with stories that are relatable to others and want to share them. So it is, you know, everyone's got their goal. For some, they just want to kind of leave a story behind for their kids or grandkids. Others imagine themselves on a bestsellers list and everything in between, and it's all fine. But to your point, you don't have to be famous as long as you've got a compelling story, something that other people can relate to and hopefully help them get through, because it's all about conflict, finding conflict to resolve so others can read about that conflict and learn from it and, apply it in their own lives. I think that's what makes the memoirs, especially compelling, is learning about what somebody got over, even if you can't relate to that exact experience, but just the general sense of having things to get over. You feel less alone when you read stories about people getting through things.
What's interesting too is, when we think of memoirs, we often think of, like autobiography, something that's written at the end of somebody's life, something that's kind of a summarization. But really, we all have these stories, and it seems like one of your focuses is drawing these stories out. I want to ask you a little bit about how people can do that, and also how you found those stories within some of the larger names that you work with that might not have been aware of some of the most interesting things about themselves. We're going to have to take a super quick break, though. Folks at home, you're not going to want to miss this when we're back in 2. Welcome back to Nights with Chris Boyle. Back on the show is author Chris Epting. So, Chris, before the break, we were talking all about memoirs. You've helped a lot of very famous people, co-written memoirs with them, helped them along the way, and you now teach regular folks like myself how they could do the same thing. And one of the interesting things we're talking about is helping people mine those stories out. And the reality is, a lot of people think memoirs, they think like, oh, this is something I'll do when I'm old and retired, and I'll put it off for tomorrow, which is what we do with so many of our ambitions. But I feel like so many young people or people in the middle of their life have a lot of these powerful stories, and a lot of the folks that you worked with, they're not at the end of their days by any measure. These are people, many of them still in the prime of their lives. Talk to us about how we can effectively kind of find those stories that might be hidden within our own story.
It's a great question. I think it begins with just taking a step back and kind of assessing where you've been, what you've learned from, and what's affected you the deepest. What are the things you kind of measure life on either side of, and starting with those stories. You don't have to be old, that's for sure. And in terms of working with people, whether it's with a well-known person or in a class, it really does become, I think, a therapeutic exercise where I'm sort of cast in this sort of quasi-therapist role of creating an environment where people are comfortable enough to mine for things and find things and share things in many cases they've never shared before with anybody, and deciding whether or not it's right for a story or a book or whatever. So it is a process. It's why I wanted to write a book about it. I had an amazing experience as a young person being mentored by a very well-known fiction writer named John Cheever, who was a neighbor of ours in Westchester County, New York. And, I wrote him a letter when I was a kid at my father's suggestion when I said I wanted to be a writer. And in fact, my new book, Where One Hears the Rain, the title is from a quote of his. And in this book, I also download my experiences with John Cheever and things I've never shared before myself. And so it really is a compendium of learning from John Cheever, what I've learned from working with other people, and then just some sort of rules of the road. But I really encourage people, take a pad of paper, write a list of 5 or 10 things, 5 moments, specific moments in your life that have been the most impactful. And then look at those individually and decide, are these things are there stories within those events? And oftentimes one of those events can produce multiple stories. And that to me is a great part of the discovery process. Until you sit down to do it, you'll never really remember what you have forgotten already. You have to apply some kind of discipline to thinking about it. And once you start doing that, there's this domino effect that I see happen all the time. It's my favorite part of the process, where one thing leads to another, to another, to another. And all of a sudden, you've got stories in front of you that are really meaningful that hopefully you're ready to share with the world.
And what's interesting to me is, it sometimes is about getting ready to share those stories, finding a way to not hold back. And for anyone at home who thinks like, oh, this is daunting, I could never write a book, 500 words is maybe about half a page. If you write 500 words every day, even just weekdays, you'll have a book in about a year's time. That's all it takes. It's amazing how it's something everyone can do. And when you're writing about your own life stories, you don't have to sit there and think like, okay, what's going to happen next? This isn't writing fiction. This is really pouring yourself out on the page. It's really, really beautiful that people have the opportunity to do this, but also that you're giving them the tools necessary, because it's one of those things where when you look at it, it's like climbing a big wall and you don't really see the way up until someone points out the path. So it's a really amazing work, and it's cool that you're putting these memoirs out with these really amazing famous people so people can get that insight. Give us, before we go really quick, where people can find, number one, all of the memoirs that you've put out with amazing folks like John Oates, like the Guitars for Def Leppard, but also tell us where we could find this book on writing memoirs for ourselves.
Where One Hears the Rain is on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. I just did the audio version of it. Wherever books are sold, you can find it. If you're interested, oh, there we are. If you're interested in a writing class, I do those online. If you go to my website, which is simply chrisepting.com, you can write me off of there. And to really quickly, Chris, to your point, you made a great point about the daunting quality of it. I equate it to road trips because I've written a lot about those. It's 1 mile at a time, one story at a time. If you start chipping away at it, you'll wake up, like you say, in a couple of months and look at it and think, oh my gosh, I've already put together a substantial part of it. So don't think of it in terms of writing a book. Think of telling a story and then another story and another story. I think it's a less intimidating way to do it. And in the end, a healthier way to do it because it takes some of the pressure off.
Well said. And it's a lot of fun, too. It's genuinely a lot of fun. Chris, it was a lot of fun talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Good seeing you again, Chris. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. It was great to have you on.